Hello, this is Power in the Word, and I'm Scott Reed. Thanks for joining me for another study session in our Come Follow Me. Today's lesson in the Doctrine and Covenants is the rest of Joseph Smith history and section 2 of the Doctrine and Covenants. As we completed the first vision last week, we get to jump in and see Moroni's visit today. And despite the persecution that Joseph has had after that first vision, he has been true and faithful in the testimony and the event that he had last week. Let's jump in then. As you can see, we're in Joseph Smith history 1, verse 29. It is on the evening of the 21st of September, 1823. He is retired to his bed at night, and he has supplicated the Lord. Notice his concern is for forgiveness of all of his sins and follies. Note, Joseph is still just a young prophet. He is mortal and faces with the challenges of being human, questioning his personal worthiness before the Lord. Like Joseph, other prophets have expressed this same concern about their worthiness, as sometimes do we. But just as God cannot look upon sin with the least degree of allowance as we become more like him, neither can we. The best people have a heightened awareness of what little of the worst is still in them. Elder Maxwell, great comment. So he petitions the Lord this evening, and his current standing, having full confidence, he says, in obtaining another divine manifestation as he had previously had. A couple of things. Notice, first of all, this is a very, very significant date, especially to ancient Israel. It falls on the day known as the Feast of Trumpets. It's a festival day, one of the 6 holy days of the year. And you can read more about it in Leviticus 23-24. We'll make more comments about it later on. Note on September 21 and 22, it seems to be an appropriate time then for Moroni to introduce the Book of Mormon to Joseph Smith. The night Moroni visited Joseph was the first day of autumn, or we know it as the first day of the harvest season. Many times in the Doctrine and Covenants, the Lord uses the symbolism of the harvest. The Lord promised that in the latter days he would harvest or gather his people for the last time, and that he would use the Book of Mormon as the tool of gathering. Combined with the Spirit of the Lord, President Benson said, the Book of Mormon is the greatest single tool which God has given us to convert the world. If we are to have the harvest of souls that we desire, then we must use the instrument which God has designed for that task, that being the Book of Mormon. So, very significant date as Joseph kneels then at the side of his bed. He says that while he was in the act of calling upon God, that a light appeared in his room, and it continues to increase until it is lighter than noonday. And immediately a personage appeared at his bedside, standing in the air, for his feet did not touch the ground. Now, maybe some interesting thoughts or details might come to mind and be considered. Note The Smith home, of which I have visited, and especially that upper room, only contains that one upper room where all the Smith children slept, sharing one bed. So here's Moroni appearing to Joseph with all the children in the same bed in the same room. The upper room has now become lighter than at noonday, and an angel is going to speak out loud most of the night. And yet none of the others in the whole house awake. Moroni, also being a resurrected being, will appear to a mortal, which requires the experience of transfiguration, which obviously Joseph has to experience. But if there are also others in the room, will they not have to be transfigured because of the glory of an angel as well? So some great details to consider. Wow. Okay. With this experience here, Moroni visiting Joseph. Joseph describes him in verse 31 and 32. He is wearing a robe. I find that fascinating. Almost temple implications. Verse 33, he calls me by name. How interesting, and maybe a good cross-reference to Joseph Smith History 1, verse 17, where that's the same thing that God the Father did in his first vision, is calling Joseph by name. So do God's servants, recognizing that heaven knows who we are, okay, and is personally involved in our lives. He says that he's a messenger sent from the presence of God, his name being Moroni. If you need more information about Moroni, you can go back to my Book of Mormon lesson in Moroni chapter 1, and I have given lots of extra details there about the man Moroni. Note at this time, Moroni indicates that God has a work for Joseph to do, and then says this significant line, that my name should be had for good and evil among all nations, kindreds, tongues, or that it should be both good and bad spoken among all people. So if you underline people here and put it with nations, kindreds, and tongues, that's 4 as a number which is significant of all mankind, which is all. That all should know the name of Joseph. Now, that is an incredible statement by Moroni. Note, Elder Callister has said, because of an article that was printed in the New York Daily Tribute concerning Joseph on July 20th, 1844, he said that Joseph Smith was a remarkable man and has left the impression of his genius upon the age, and his name will be remembered for good and evil when the names of half the ephemeral, which is short-lived, okay, brief statesmen of all the ages will be forgotten. It's an interesting note that, for example, the greatest probably statesman of our country is that of George Washington. Yet, George Washington in the Library of Congress is mentioned in 2,556 books, where Joseph Smith's name appears in over 20,000 volumes of books. Truly, the prophecy given here in 1823 that Joseph's name would be had among all nations is certainly coming true. Moroni then indicates in verse 34 that there has been a book deposited in gold plates by the former inhabitants, known as the Book of Mormon people here on this continent. It's interesting that Moroni is the one that indicates where the book is, because he's the one that buried it. And that it is not the only thing that was deposited, but verse 35, underline the breastplate, 35, the Urim and Thummim. Note, the Hebrew words Urim and Thummim means lights and perfection, respectively, and the person who uses them is supposed to be called a seer. They are generally associated with the translation of unknown languages, as Mosiah 8 indicates in the Book of Mormon. However, many of the early sections of the Doctrine and Covenants were also received with the help of the Urim and Thummim, as I've noted here, those sections. Moroni then in verse 36 begins to quote scripture to Joseph. Fascinating that he quotes Malachi, the 3rd chapter, and the 4th chapter, okay, with a little variation from what it reads in our current Bible. Okay, these verses from Malachi quoted to Joseph will chronologically become the first section of the Doctrine and Covenants known as Section 2. You can underline them in verse 37, 38, and 39. However, part of this lesson is looking at Section 2 of the Doctrine and Covenants, which obvious priority is given as being the first chronological section in the latter days. So let's jump over to the Doctrine and Covenants for a minute. Here we find in Section 2 a section that was placed, note, in the Doctrine and Covenants in 1876 by Elder Orson Pratt under the direction of President Brigham Young. It is then the earliest, chronologically speaking, revelation contained in the Doctrine and Covenants. Both of these translations, however, Moroni's, the Doctrine and Covenants, and Malachi's, even with their different nuances there, are correct, as mentioned by Elder McConkie. Both convey the mind and will of the Lord, and both teach sound and true doctrine. Taken together, they gather us an expanded and a comprehensive view of the mission of Elijah that we would not gain from either of them alone. Brother Ludlow has said, Moroni's alteration from the Bible and the Book of Mormon text were probably for emphasis and clarification rather than for correction. Others have written that the differences in the text as quoted by Moroni, section 2 here, should not be thought of as the original words of Malachi, but more correctly as a plainer translation to fit our own language and understanding. It is an example of the differences in languages as spoken of in section 1, verse 24 that I've covered. That when revelation is given, we have to come down to the language and understanding of the person the revelation is being given to. So, interesting insight here, so that a rendering of a plainer translation of section 2 might help us in our understanding. Okay, note then, section 2, verse 1 states, "Behold, I, God, will reveal unto you, Joseph, the priesthood by the hand of Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord." Now, being section 2, it certainly, as I've pointed out, holds priority over all other sections. It's the first message, which is the message of Malachi, which is so important that it is the only verses in all of Scripture that are repeated in all standard works. You can find them here in the Doctrine and Covenants, in the Pearl of Great Price in Joseph Smith History, in 3rd Nephi in the Book of Mormon, and Malachi in the Bible. Hence, an incredible priority to this section. Note it is also given concerning the hand of a prophet named Elijah. Notice in Hebrew, Eli is short for Elohim, who is the Father. Jah in Elijah is short for Jehovah, who is the Son. Hence, the priesthood key held by the prophet Elijah is described in his name. It is the turning of the hearts of the fathers to their sons, and from their sons to their fathers. Isn't that incredible? Always important to know and understand the meaning of names in Scripture. They play an important part in the mission of the person that bears the name. Now note, although many people expect Elijah to return, they do not understand why or what he will do when he does come. Without the restoration of the further understanding that Joseph Smith provided in this dispensation, the purpose and fulfillment of Elijah's return would not be accessible to us. So here's the why and the what. Note then, we have what I call the 5 P's of section 2. The first being that of priority. Second is that of a priesthood key. Third, the planting of in the hearts of the children the promises of the Father. And there's 3, the promises of the Father then placed in the hearts of the children. And last of all, verse 3, you're going to see there is a penalty attached if this does not occur as prophesied by Malachi and now by Moroni, or the coming of one Elijah the prophet with his priesthood key. Now, why a priesthood key? Note that Elijah was the last prophet that held the keys of the priesthood, and who will, before the last dispensation, restore the authority and deliver the keys of the priesthood in order that all the ordinances may be attended to in righteousness. Sometimes we don't catch the why. We say that Elijah holds a sealing key. And many times we relate that to our posterity and the sealing that can take place. However, note that it is upon all ordinances that must be attended to. Or, as spoken of here, because Elijah came with the proper priesthood keys, all other ordinances for the living and the dead. That includes baptism, confirmations, ordinations, washings, anointings, endowments, sealings, so forth, have real meaning and are of efficacy, virtue, and force in the eternal world. A great cross-reference would be Doctrine and Covenants 132, verse 7. That's a must, where we talk about the sealing key upon all things, or it has no effect in the next world. That's what this sealing key does. It seals it good here and good there. So note, John A. Witzo makes this statement when he says, the beginning and the end of the gospel is written in section 2 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Wow! That has to be one of the most incredible statements concerning this section. You might want to be sure to get that one in your scriptures. And that it will come, or a great and dreadful day will occur. And in context, as I've mentioned before, it suggests that it's not a good or a bad day, but that it's a mighty day. It's a great and a dreadful day. So it's sometimes we take that to mean that it's great for the good and dreadful for the bad. Well, that may be true. But the Hebrew, as I mentioned here, the Hebrew word that is translated as great basically carries the same meaning it typically has for us, meaning something large in size or of high importance or value. The word dreadful is more complicated. Dreadful comes from the Hebrew word that means to fear or to be fearful, but it can also convey the idea of in awe or of great respect. And so the coming day is a huge event that we will all be in awe of, that being the second coming. Okay, so better help on that verse with those insights. Verse 2 comes down to our second P, and that is Elijah will plant in the hearts of the children the promises made to the fathers, and the hearts of the children shall turn to their fathers. Note the word plant here suggests something that is going to grow and become stronger and stronger. Joseph Fielding Smith has stated, the turning of the hearts of the children to the fathers is placing or planting in the hearts of the children the feelings and desires which will inspire them to search out the records of their dead. Moreover, the planting of the desire and inspiration in their hearts is necessary. This that they must have in order that they might go into the house of the Lord and perform the necessary labor for their fathers who died without a knowledge of the gospel or without the privilege of receiving the fullness of the gospel. Note then is also this word promise. This expression has a reference to certain promises made to those who died already without a knowledge of the gospel and without the opportunity of receiving the sealing ordinances of the priesthood in matters pertaining to their exaltation. According to these promises, the children in the latter days are to perform all such ordinances in behalf of the dead. Note the late Kimball, writing to her husband, Heber C. Kimball, who had been serving a mission in England in 1840, said, "Some have already been baptized a number of times over. Those that have no friends on the earth to be baptized for them can send ministering spirits to whomsoever they will and make known their request. Thus, you see, there is a chance for all." Is this not a glorious doctrine? Joseph Smith stated that the greatest responsibility in this world that God has laid upon us is to seek after our dead. Which one happens of greater intensity then? Our forefathers to us, their children, or from us as children to our forefathers? If it's going to grow stronger and stronger, which one in this verse then occurs with more intensity? Well, Elder Melvin J. Ballard stated, "Why is it that sometimes only one of a city or household received the gospel? It was made known to me that it is because of the righteous dead who had received the gospel in the spirit world exercised themselves, and in answer to their prayers, elders of the church were sent to the homes of their posterity, that the gospel might be taught to them, and through their righteousness they might be privileged to have a descendant in the flesh do the work for their dead kindred." Here's the line you need. I want to say to you that it is with greater intensity that the hearts of the fathers and mothers in the spirit world are turned to their children than that our hearts are turned to them. So there's your insight. Note, how then are our hearts turned from children to forefather? Well, in two ways. The living must emulate the dead. We must be like Abraham if we want Abraham's covenant. And we express concern for those who have gone on before us. So how are our forefathers then? How do their hearts turn to us as their children? Well, the dead return with revelation and guidance. The dead return with priesthood keys. The dead remind the living of covenants we have made to them premortally, and the dead guide the living in genealogy and temple work, as I'll show a story in a minute below. Note, they know where their records are, and the spirit and influence of your dead will guide those who are interested in finding those records. If there is anywhere on the earth anything concerning them, you will find it. If we have done our best, Elder Ballard, and have searched and have discovered all that is available, then the day will come when God will open and part the veil, and the records will be revealed. Elder Haight, I believe that when you diligently seek after your ancestors in faith, needed information will come to you, even when no mortal records of their lives are available. Wow. Okay, so now let's look at an insight that Joseph gives us. He uses the word, instead of plant, here in verse 2, he says the word should be turn. So we don't plant this in their hearts, but our hearts are turned, or bind or seal are even better words. Okay? Let your hearts be turned to your children and teach your children, but you must do it when they are young enough to be schooled. And if you are neglecting your family home evenings, you are neglecting the beginning of the mission of Elijah, just as certainly as if you were neglecting your research work of genealogy. Harold B. Lee. Note then this thought. Susa Young Gates once asked her father, Brigham Young, how all of this was to take place and be done. How it could possibly accomplish all the great among the temple work that was going to be required at our hands. It's interesting that Brigham Young then made this comment. He told her there would be many inventions and labor-saving devices so that our daily duties could be performed in a short time, leaving us more and more time for temple work. The inventions have come and are still coming, but many simply divert the time gained to other channels and not for the purpose intended by the Lord. So I hope that you see the importance of this work and have the Spirit move or plant in your hearts so that they might be turned to the work of the Lord as He intended, that this might go forward. Verse 3 states, then the penalty. If, I love ifs in scriptures, I've told you that, so I've highlighted it. If this does not happen, then the whole earth would be utterly wasted at His coming. Note the whole purpose then for which this earth, right here, was created was to house, save, and exalt God's children. Good conduct without the ordinances of the gospel, Elder Packer stated, will neither redeem nor exalt mankind. Covenants and ordinances are essential. President Smith, the sealing power of Elijah make it possible for this joining of the families. Generation to generation, back to the beginning. Now, if these units of authority were not here, then the work of sealing by which the family units were preserved could not be performed. Then the binding power by which all blessings are sealed in heaven, as well as on earth, would be lacking. If this were so, the earth would be smitten with a curse for all work which had been done without these binding or sealing ordinances. All our ordinances would fall to the ground unfulfilled. And here's that reference again, Doctrine and Covenants 132, verse 7, a must to get into your scriptures. Note, it is interesting that Elijah has come, as recorded in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 110, 13 through 16, one you need to get in your notes or footnote. And on this day, the Jews were celebrating the feast of Passover and were leaving the doors of their homes open for the coming of Elijah. On that day, Elijah came, but not to the Jewish homes, but to the temple in the village of Kirtland, near the banks of Lake Erie, to two humble servants of the Lord who were appointed by divine decree to receive him. Absolutely fascinating. Section 2. Here is 2 stories. I promised you may want to note them for your own record and maybe take a screenshot and get them into either your journals or your scriptures. They are fascinating on how the work of the dead has moved forward. Okay, with that, we've covered then section 2, this little teeny section of just 3 verses. It's just incredible what was contained there. And we move back now to Moroni, who is going to continue his quoting of Scripture to Joseph in Joseph Smith History 1, verse 40. Notice he's going to quote Isaiah. Be sure you underline it, because Moroni said it's about ready to be fulfilled in chapter 11. He then quotes Acts chapter 3 and says it too is about ready to be fulfilled. 41, he then quotes the second chapter of Joel. Notice these all out of the Bible. In the 28th verse to the end, and says it too is about ready to be fulfilled. And he quoted, notice, many other passages of Scripture and offered many explanations which cannot be mentioned here, soon to be accomplished. Now, I don't know about you, but you probably should have a list of the verses that were cited by Moroni, for the very fact that Moroni is going to quote them to the first prophet of this dispensation 3 different times that night and once in the morning. That should tell you that these verses are critical to our understanding. Note, there were 83 verses of Scripture, and I've listed them for you here, quoted by Moroni, not selected at random, but specific verses that were introduced to him as the lead and founder of the Church of Christ in these last days. They've been printed in the Ensign. Right here, I've given you the place, and not only the 83, as you can see here, those 83 verses. In fact, I can show you, there you go, a slide that gives you all 83 verses here, but not only the 83 verses, but the gospel subject that they cover, which is absolutely